This is a map from the START database showing terrorist attacks in 2020, rated on a scale of intensity. And this map is from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute mapping the armed conflicts in 2020. Perhaps you notice something. When the maps are overlaid, it becomes clear that where there are terrorist attacks, there are often also armed conflicts. And although once can happen, twice is a coincidence and thrice is a pattern, 4 times, well, that's perhaps a bit suspicious. Armed conflict could be an umbrella term which includes terrorism in this case, but as the map from CIPRI only takes into account conflicts with at least 25 fatalities, many terrorist attacks will be excluded, though it is unknown if all are excluded, as terrorism is very difficult to both define and distinguish from other forms of political violence and violent crime. There seems to be a visible pattern. Where there is armed conflict, there appears to be terrorism. Whether this is a direct link or not is yet to be seen. Now, over the course of this video, the idea is not to define either terrorism or armed conflict, as defining terrorism is an arduous task. It will be mentioned, but it will not be addressed in depth. The focus will be on possible connections between terrorism and armed conflicts using 4 different nations, a topic which does not have extensive study, as usually the two phenomena are treated separately and not together. Elaborating on the topic with the use of wonderful images from databases and research institutes, and sometimes Google and poorly done stick drawings, for I am regrettably a political science student and not an artist. The 4 nations examined will be Afghanistan, Yemen, Mali, and Colombia. The different nations were chosen not only because of the overall high rate of both terrorism and armed conflict, with Afghanistan entirely covered in the map from start, but also because generally speaking they are distributed across the globe and not concentrated in one area of the world. This will hopefully give a clearer global understanding instead of a regional understanding which may not uphold in other parts of the world. Primarily, I do want to provide attention to the general similarities and differences between terrorism and armed conflict, like, for example, how both are characterized by violence. They are both thought to be violent acts, but terrorism is thought of as a short-term occurrence, often a singular attack. Civil war is thought to be more long-term. This is not to say that a terrorist organization cannot plan a slew of attacks over a longer period, nor is it to say that all civil wars drag out for years on end, but typically they are thought of in this way. Additionally, depending on how terrorism is defined, a state or government cannot be terrorists or perform terrorist attacks. Whilst often in civil war one of the parties involved is the government or people in power. Then again, that is a definition-based difference, which will not always hold up. Stathis Khalifas would argue that terrorism involves violence on a much lower scale than civil war. Yet others argue that the distinction between terrorism and civil war lies in the perpetrator, that it lies in recognizing that certain actors are terrorists, whereas others are insurgents in civil war. But an actor-based approach would rely more on the individual person and their actions, which would be defined by certain criteria. But how do we define those criteria when there is not even an agreed upon definition of terrorism? It likely just turns into an argument of justified violence, which is perhaps even trickier to navigate. The actor-based approach assumes that the differences between a terrorist and an insurgent would be that the insurgents hold territory, they depend on the support of the population, they are not clandestine, and they create larger amounts of violence. But how does one measure, for example, support of the population? Under threat of violence, it is difficult to be honest about one's support. Similarly, groups may hold territory and then lose it later on. Would that affect their status? Would they go from legitimate insurgents to illegitimate terrorists at the loss of their territory? Allowing for terrorism to be defined by the actor does not seem effective and allows for no overlap between terrorism and civil war or armed conflict. An action-based definition will hold up much better both as a whole and in trying to link it to civil war. It is easiest to look at terrorism as a possible strategy or tactic to employ, nothing more than a means to an end. In that case, terrorism can be tied to civil war as something that falls under it. Civil war or armed conflict is the whole, and terrorism is one of its possible pieces. Terrorism can be used both before, during, and after civil wars as a tactic. Andrew Kidd and Barbara Walter offer 5 strategies of terrorism, or 5 ends to which terrorism can be used: provocation, attrition, intimidation, outbidding, and spoiling. Provocation and attrition can both be used before the Civil War. Provocation involves using the superior force of the state against itself, to provoke the target into a disproportionate response, to radicalize moderates, and build support for the ambitious goals over the long term, as per David Lake. Attrition has to do with the need a violent group has to signal strength and resolve to its opponent. It is like showing they are serious and a force to be reckoned with. This method may be used to spark a conflict or maintain it. Intimidating and outbidding are both tactics employed during a civil war. Intimidation is the use of violence directed at members of the general population. It is used to sway and control them. Outbidding, comparably, is a competition for public support, trying to get the public to support the cause. At the end, or after the conflict, one may use spoiling, the act of ruining the peace or casting doubt on peace processes and negotiations, usually used either because the more extreme of the group are not content with the terms of negotiation, or to force more concessions. In many cases, peace negotiations aren't reneged afterwards. Terrorism does not have to be a tactic within the scope of civil war, but it can be used as such. It is easiest to evaluate as such when trying to put the two together. Now, according to Statista, a total number of 1,722 terrorist attacks were registered in Afghanistan in 2020. And, as per the map from Findley, Afghanistan is a place with major armed conflicts. In Afghanistan in 2020, U.S. troops were involved with the Taliban, which was attacking Afghan security forces and civilians. The Taliban is a Sunni Islamist nationalist and pro-Pashtun movement. They are responsible for most attacks in Afghanistan, committing both suicide and complex attacks. The prior, a method primarily thought of to be used by terrorists. Even so, currently the Taliban has a sense of legitimacy as they return to power in 2021. They are not always referred to as a terrorist organization, instead referred to as insurgents, or as being affiliated with terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda. There has even been an attempt trying to include the Taliban in counterterrorism efforts during peace negotiations, as according to the Global Conflict Tracker, a peace deal, known as the Doha Agreement, was signed in February 2020, in which the Taliban pledged to prevent territory under its control from being used by terrorist groups. Negotiations in 2020 faced multiple delays and little progress, in part because the Taliban quickly resumed its attacks. The Taliban is not on the United States list of foreign terrorists despite its terrorist tactics and collusion with terrorists. Of course, this can come back to a definition problem, where since they are in control of Afghanistan and the state actors, they cannot be terrorists, in some instances. For example, where terrorism is defined as perpetrated specifically by non-state actors. The type of terrorism most common in Afghanistan seems to be extremist religious terrorism, in part because the Taliban allowed it, and likely in part because of the civil unrest present, making it easier to get into the nation to perform attacks. Overall, Afghanistan here is an example of a terrorist tactic used as a means to an end, similarly to how it seems to be an example of civil unrest used by terrorist organizations in principle unrelated to the armed conflict in the nation to take action within the nation. Yemen. In Yemen, Houthi rebels have taken control of a part of the country. There is now a proxy conflict with Saudi Arabia backing the government and Iran backing the rebels, taking place in Yemen. The Houthi do not get referred to as terrorists, but as militants. Of course, there is no absence of terrorism in Yemen. Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, an Islamist militant group, and the related Ansar al-Ahmadiyya insurgent group have captured territory in the south and east. Terrorist groups have benefited from the unrest in Yemen and not only captured territory, but also provided citizens with public services currently unfulfilled by the state, which has strengthened the support these groups have. Yemen is an example of a war-torn state as breeding ground for foreign terrorism, not only to perform attacks, but also to find new supporters and followers. As they're providing us what the people are lacking, considering the current humanitarian crisis in Yemen, is a relatively easy means of gathering supporters. There is a high degree of political unrest and dissatisfaction in Mali. Some years back a coup took place, followed by military intervention in the north and regular uprisings by rebel and extremist groups throughout the country. Despite the overall political issues and unrest in Mali, the terrorist groups do not seem to focus on that, but instead seem to use the instability in the country to base themselves there and to attempt to gain control in the nation, attacking security posts and military bases. Mali is another example of a nation being used by terrorist groups unrelated to the conflict to further their own agenda. These groups seem to be trying to provoke the still sitting government by attacking it, and might be hoping to take control of more territory. Colombia faced a resurgence of violence, with at least 5 continuing conflicts with armed groups affecting the daily lives of Colombians, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross. There was a peace deal with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, who are leftist rebels, which was intended to end the conflict, but violence has been increasing again. They are in part FARC members who reject the terms of the peace deal and refuse to lay down their arms, and in part the ELN, another violent group in Colombia that commits these acts as well. There seems to be an absence of a terrorist organization trying to profit off of the civil unrest. Instead, it seems as terrorism was used specifically as a tactic and continues to be used as such, currently primarily as a means of spoiling the existing peace deal. Terrorism is not solely seen in connection to civil war, but the two phenomena are related. Terrorism is not only a possible strategy or tactic in civil war, but in the cases discussed primarily for spoiling, like in Colombia, and outbidding, as seen in Yemen, but also to flourish in civil war. The civil unrest and political instability create an opportunity for terrorist organizations. The issue here is that counterterrorism is difficult in this case. If there is an extremist group trying to spoil negotiations, is the other party supposed to press on or relent? Neither sounds like viable options, but peace does not seem possible anymore either. Similarly, how should the failing government of a nation protect its civilians and prevent terrorism from taking root? Without international help, it would be very difficult to do anything about this, and the international help is not necessarily perfect. Overall, as has briefly been shown here, civil wars or armed conflicts and terrorism are closely related for multiple reasons. It is a topic worth further research, as the understanding of the relation between these two topics can help both define terrorism, like can terrorists occupy territory, for example, and perhaps even prevent it. Of course, that may be an ambitious hope, but it is apparent there is a connection between acts of terrorism and civil war, even if that connection solely lies in how people choose to define terrorism and civil war alike. The two topics cannot be separated, either for the reality of terrorist tactics used during civil wars, or of civil war creating a vulnerability which terrorist organizations can and do exploit.